Amboseli Reserve, past midnight. The wind had settled, leaving the acacia scrub still and soundless. Inside the outer perimeter of the ranger camp, a low fire smoldered, not for warmth, but to keep hyenas from circling too close. Most of the team had turned in. Only 2 remained outside, finishing the last pot of boiled water. The air was dry enough to hold every sound, which is why they heard the drag before they saw the shape. At first, it seemed like wind moving dust. But dust doesn't stop. Dust doesn't breathe. The figure at the edge of the clearing didn't walk. It pulled itself forward with the front legs, belly scraping against the soil, limbs weak and angled oddly beneath its weight. The ears gave it away. They flopped sideways with each crawl, too large for the narrow shoulders. It was a calf, small, alone, crawling out of the darkness. Neither ranger moved immediately. There was no call for help, no rush. The rules here were different at night. Slower. They watched. The calf paused just beyond the firelight, not quite in, not quite out. Then it dragged forward again, 2 short pulls. No sound came from it. Not a cry, not a trumpet, not even breath loud enough to catch. The body was thin, not from age but from absence. Absence of food, of water, of herd. The skin along the ribs had creased into dry ridges. 1 foot curled under, likely bruised or sprained. The eyes reflected the fire in a dull shine. It wasn't fear that showed. It was distance. The kind of silence animals fall into when there's no longer anything to wait for. Elian, the senior ranger on night duty, finally stood. No sudden moves, no torch. Just a slow walk to the edge of the fire's glow. The calf didn't retreat. It watched him, blinked once and tried again to move. Another short push forward, then collapse. The front legs spread out and stayed. He had nothing left. There were no adult tracks nearby. Elian scanned behind the calf and found no trail of trampling. No broken brush, only 2 faint belly grooves leading in from the south ridge. If there had been a herd, it was gone long before. No prints meant no mother had circled back. The calf had likely been alone for hours, if not longer. It shouldn't have made it this far. Elian spoke quietly, not to the calf, but to the other ranger behind him. "Don't touch him yet." There was no need to explain why. If the calf startled, he'd spend what little strength remained. If he collapsed fully, even breathing would turn costly. The camp remained quiet. The radio stayed off. The decision was not to move, but to wait. One of the water buckets from the basin was brought near and set down without sound. A soaked cloth laid gently into the dust, not offered, just placed. The calf lifted its head a few inches. The trunk dangled, curled at the tip. Then it dropped again. There was no attempt to rise, only the instinct to move toward the one thing it recognized. Warmth. The fire. It took another 10 minutes for the calf to reach the edge of the heat. Not the flames, just the line where warm air drifted across the soil. He didn't touch the bucket, didn't lift his trunk. He simply laid his head against the ground and stopped crawling. This close, they could see the red dust clinging inside his ears. His breathing was shallow but even. His tail, thin and motionless. His spine was visible where it shouldn't be. If no herd came back, he wouldn't last till dawn. If he moved too much, the strain would break him. If they pushed too early, he could go into shock. The stakes were as clear as the stars above. Wait, and he might live. Intervene, and he might not. Elian took his seat again by the fire, not facing it, facing the calf. He didn't speak. No one did. The wind didn't return. The calf didn't cry. In the space between them, the fire shifted slightly and kept burning. By morning, the sky had barely changed, just a lighter shade of gray above the saltthorn trees. The calf hadn't moved. He lay with his legs folded beneath him, trunk curled near his front feet, eyes half closed but open enough to watch. The fire had burned down to coals. His body was too still for comfort, but his chest lifted and fell in rhythm. He was alive. Barely. Elian rose before the others. He had not slept. A decision hung quietly in his body, something unspoken but already made. The first light would tell them everything the night had hidden. Within minutes, 2 scouts joined him. They headed toward the south ridge where the calf had emerged. No need for full gear. They weren't tracking danger. They were looking for answers. The brush was dry but sparse. Hoof prints should have held here, so should the wide circular drag of an elephant's gait. But the earth was clean. Not undisturbed. Just missing what mattered. There were faint impressions from the calf's crawl, belly marks, toe scrapes where he had twisted slightly, but nothing around him. No deeper prints from a larger animal, no brush disturbed higher than a few inches. No broken branches, no urine scent, no dung. Elian bent low beside one impression and pressed his palm into the earth. The ground was warm, untouched by weight. A full herd would have left the soil torn. Even a lone mother would have flattened a trail, but there was nothing. The calf had not been separated. He had come alone. Back at camp, the others waited. The calf had shifted slightly onto his right side, not from energy but likely from exhaustion. A wet cloth had been placed beside his trunk again. He hadn't reached for it. When Elian returned, his silence spoke first. He looked toward the calf, then back to the scouts. "No tracks," he said. "None." That word settled over them like dust. None meant the calf had not wandered. None meant no one was looking for him. A volunteer stepped closer to examine him fully. No bruising, no gashes, no limp, just a dry coat, sagging skin, and hollow sides that told the same story in every breath. Starvation, not trauma. The team circled in quiet debate. Could he have been born prematurely and rejected? Maybe. But premature calves rarely survive long enough to crawl alone. Could the herd have been scattered by predators? Unlikely. There were no signs of urgency. No torn brush or broken patterns in the ground. Then one of the older rangers said it plainly. He wasn't lost. They looked again at the calf with new weight in their eyes. He hadn't wandered off. He had been left, placed or abandoned near the edge of the camp, close enough to be seen but far enough to disappear if no one looked. For a moment the breeze returned. It moved gently over the camp, catching ash from the fire pit and lifting it in soft spirals. The calf's ears fluttered once. A faint twitch. His eyes blinked slowly. Someone whispered, "He didn't come from here." The reality reshaped everything. If he was placed here, who had done it, and why? If he was wild-born, something was deeply wrong with the herd. If he wasn't wild-born at all, then the question shifted from why he was alone to what he had escaped from. Elian crouched beside the calf again. He didn't touch him. Not yet. The body was still too fragile, and trust couldn't be earned in one night. But he spoke quietly, just once. "You came a long way." The calf didn't react, but he didn't move away either. Whatever he had come from, this fire had been his choice, and that meant something had been worse than crawling alone through dust. By late morning, the sun broke fully across the reserve, casting long bands of heat through the sparse trees. The calf had not stood. His legs remained tucked beneath him, too weak to stretch, too dry to cramp. His body didn't sleep. But it didn't resist the weight of time either. He was still. The fire had been rekindled with softer wood, not for light, but for warmth. The temperature would rise soon, but the ground still held the night's chill, and the calf had inched closer during the hours between. Not with effort, not with intent, just a slow shift forward, as if the heat was the only thing his body still recognized. Elian stayed near. He hadn't left the ring of the fire since returning from the ridge. Others moved around them, gathering supplies, checking the vehicles, reviewing maps, but Elian remained. His presence was not medical, not commanding. It was steady. The calf's breathing was shallow. His trunk lay folded beneath his jaw, unmoving except when it trembled slightly at the tip. He made no sound, no call, no moan, no soft cry of discomfort. But the trembling spread. First the tip of the trunk, then the ears. Then, barely visible, the skin along the flank. A ripple beneath the ribs. As if the body didn't know whether it was too cold or too empty. It wasn't seizure. It wasn't illness. It was the quiet trembling of a calf that had held still too long. Muscles fading. Body drifting toward the line between rest and collapse. Elian didn't speak. He reached for a cloth, one soaked in the basin water and warmed gently beside the firestones. He dipped it once more and carried it low in his hand, fingers trailing the edge to keep it from dripping. Then, slowly, he moved toward the calf. The body did not react. No flinch, no eye shift, no change in breath. He laid the cloth near the trunk. Not on it, just close enough for moisture to speak first. Still no reaction. Then, almost imperceptibly, the calf's trunk twitched once toward it. Not a lift, not a reach, just a soft, involuntary lean toward dampness. That was enough. Elian didn't move further. He sat down cross-legged just beside the fire, letting the warmth carry between them. It was the same distance the calf had chosen to stop at, not near enough for touch but not far enough to ignore. Trust would not come from action. Not yet, not here. It would come from stillness. The team watched from the edge of the clearing. None approached. They didn't need to. Everything important was happening in the silence. A slow hour passed. The calf's ears stopped trembling. Not because strength returned, but because he had given in to stillness. His eyes closed halfway, not asleep, but resting. Breathing remained even. The wet cloth dried in the dust beside him. Elian didn't replace it. One offering was enough. The stakes had not changed. If the calf rose too soon, his body would give out. If they fed him too quickly, his gut could fail. If they left him untouched, the night might claim him. But for now, the trembling had stopped, and in its place, something quieter had taken root. Not safety, not yet. Just presence. The fire crackled softly. Elian leaned back on his palms, eyes on the calf, who had stopped watching but had not turned away. The space between them no longer felt like a line. It felt like a pause. A breath held in shared understanding. And just before the sun reached its peak, the calf exhaled long and low. Not loud, not weak, just enough to say, "I'm still here." The dawn light came pale and fast, brushing across the cracked soil like dust in motion. Somewhere behind the horizon, a hyena called twice and fell quiet. Elian was already standing. The calf hadn't moved more than a few inches through the night, but his breathing had held steady. His ears fluttered once at the cold, then stilled. The fire had burned low again, but its warmth had done enough. For now. 2 scouts, Nuru and Toma, had been out since first light, cutting north by the ridge where the calf had first appeared. They weren't tracking the calf this time. They were looking for the why. At the edge of the gully, the brush thinned into packed clay, and just where the land dipped, they found what the soil had hidden in shadow the day before. Faint, partial tire marks. Not deep enough for heavy transport, but wide enough for load-bearing tread. Too straight, too smooth. No dust drifted over them. They hadn't been there long. Nuru crouched beside the impression and ran his fingers through the edge. The clay flaked where the sidewall had bitten in. Then she glanced around. No boot prints, no drag marks, no human scat. The vehicle hadn't stayed. It had entered from the east, turned once and left again. Same direction. No trail of feed or blood. Just the marks and silence. Back at camp, the calf still had not stood. His trunk had moved once in the night, curling against his chest and unfolding again. But it hadn't reached for the cloth. The others had begun mixing a weak hydration blend, just sugar and salt and boiled water. It wasn't meant for nourishment. It was meant to tell the body that food might come later, that the stomach was still needed. When the scouts returned, they brought only one thing, a thin strip of plastic twine, coated in red dust, knotted 3 times at the end. It had been pressed into the dirt near the tire tracks. Elian held it between 2 fingers. The knot was too clean for bush use, too deliberate, not rope for hauling, not line for tethering. It had been used to seal something, likely a sack, a tarp, or worse. He said nothing for a while. Then, he wasn't born here. No one disagreed. There was no herd in the area, no recent elephant movement, and now, signs of human presence near the only path the calf could have taken. The conclusion was no longer speculation. This calf hadn't been separated by accident. He'd been delivered. That changed the stakes. If he was born wild and stolen, there was a poaching site somewhere nearby. If he was born in captivity, illegal or otherwise, then someone had dumped him deliberately near a fire, not to save him, but to rid themselves of the burden. Either way, he was never meant to survive. That made his crawl even more impossible. That made his choice to approach humans, to move toward the flame, something even more unexplainable. A calf this young should have hidden, should have cried, should have waited for his mother's scent. But he had done none of that. He had crossed open soil in silence and laid down by strangers. Elian placed the twine beside the dried cloth. The calf blinked once, slow and unfocused, but didn't lift his head. The hydration solution was ready, but they waited. If his stomach had been empty too long, even liquid could harm him. Timing had to be exact. Every step from now forward held risk. If he took too much too fast, his system could shut down. If he didn't take it at all, the clock was already counting backward. The silence around the fire felt heavier now, not because of what was lost, but because of what had been almost taken. The calf was no longer just an orphan. He was evidence of something deliberate, something wrong. And still in the circle of heat he lay without fear, thin skin rising and falling, eyes half-lidded but steady. He had not come from this land, but he had chosen this fire. The sun had climbed just past its first peak when they gave him the water. It was not poured, not offered in a bowl. Elian held the cloth again, soaked this time with a thin mixture of glucose, salt, and warmth. He pressed it lightly to the calf's lips. No movement at first, then a shift, subtle, slow. The trunk twitched and curled, not away but toward the cloth. The calf's tongue grazed it. It was enough. For the next 20 minutes, no one spoke. Elian worked by rhythm, not force, dipping, pressing, pausing, letting the calf taste, not drink. The first full swallow didn't come until the cloth was nearly dry, but it came. His throat moved. 1 clean swallow, then 2. That was the turn. By noon, his ears flicked once more, and his eyes, though still dull, began to track. The fire had been reduced to coals now. Low heat, no smoke. The shade had been adjusted with tarp scraps and branches. He was surrounded by presence, not interference. Still, he hadn't stood. His legs remained folded beneath him like sticks stacked too tightly, unable to shift without snapping. But then, without signal or sound, his head lifted. He looked toward the fire. Not at Elian, not at the cloth, at the center of the ring, where warmth met earth. And then he moved. First came the front legs. They tensed and adjusted, hooves scraping soil. Then he shifted weight onto them, too fast, and collapsed sideways. The sound was soft, but it pulled everyone's gaze. No one rushed. Elian didn't even lean forward. He just sat up straighter. Knees drawn to his chest, eyes level with the calf's. The second attempt was harder. His front legs straightened again, trembling. He tried to pull the hindquarters underneath, but they didn't respond. One leg slipped. His body twisted, and he fell forward into the dust. The risk was sharp now. If he fell wrong, he could dislocate the knee or strain a tendon. If they stepped in, it might break the fragile trust between effort and instinct. So they waited. On the third try, the calf didn't lift his head first. He lifted his tail. Just a flick, just enough to suggest will. Then the legs moved again. All four. The front came up fast this time. Strength born of desperation or maybe memory. Then the back legs. Wobbly, bent, unsure. But they held. And suddenly he was standing. Not straight, not steady, but standing. A breath passed through the camp like wind. He swayed. A slow, rhythmic lean from left to right, the kind that would drop him if he overcorrected. His trunk hung low, nearly brushing the ground, and his mouth remained slightly open as if surprised by the new altitude. Elian stood too, slow and still. A whisper came from behind him, one of the younger rangers, barely audible. He chose this place, not as praise, not as pride, as fact, because calves that collapse stay down. Calves born in the wild, abandoned or traded, don't approach human fire unless there's no wild left in them. And even then, they don't stand unless they believe the ground will hold them. The calf's legs trembled, but they held. Dust clung to his belly where it had dragged for hours. His spine was curved, his ribs clear. But he had lifted himself. Now came the next decision. Would he walk? He didn't. Instead, he stood for 1 full minute, then lowered himself again. Slow, controlled, deliberate. Not a fall, a choice. He folded into the space beside the fire and laid his head down on the soil that still held heat. This time, he faced them. By evening, the wind changed. It no longer blew from the east, where the dry flats carried dust and silence. Now it moved from the south, warm, full of scent, brushing over the camp like something returning. The calf had stood 3 more times since morning, each time steadier, each time slower. He still hadn't walked, but he had turned his body toward the sound of water being poured into a basin. Not to drink, just to know it was there. When the sun dipped, Elian knelt beside him again, cloth folded in his palm. This time the calf didn't wait for it to be placed. He reached, barely, and touched the cloth with the tip of his trunk, then let it fall. He wasn't hungry yet, but he had begun to respond. Across the clearing, another group had been watching. 3 adolescent elephants from the nearby sanctuary herd, rescues, like him, stood behind the wire barrier that marked the soft boundary between human and animal space. One of them, taller, with a slight curve in the left tusk, paced slowly back and forth. Her name was Rika. She'd been brought in 2 years earlier, found half buried beneath a collapsed mud wall during the floods. She was the first to pick up the scent. The calf had begun moving again, slowly, deliberately, small steps in a half circle around the coals. He didn't look at the fire, he didn't look at the humans, but he circled. Once, then stopped. Elian rose but didn't close the space. He simply lowered his hand. Palm outward, fingers curled slightly. A pause. The calf blinked. Then he stepped closer, just half a pace, and leaned into the open hand. Not for food, for weight. The side of his face brushed Elian's fingers, rough skin dragging over dry knuckles. The calf held still. Just long enough to recognize presence, just long enough to borrow balance. Then he moved away again. From across the wire, Rika stepped forward. Her ears pressed back slightly. No warning, no threat, just interest. She let out a short, low rumble, almost a question. The calf froze. Then slowly, his trunk lifted in her direction, wavering in the air, tracing scent. The moment held. They didn't touch, but he turned his body halfway toward her. Recognition lives in scent before memory. Whatever he'd been near before, plastic, rubber, oil, tarps, it wasn't what she carried. Rika had known other calves, other rescues. Maybe she recognized what he didn't yet understand about himself. That he was no longer alone. The calf lowered his trunk again and moved back toward the fire. He stopped just beside it, the place he had collapsed days ago, and eased his weight into the ground. Not sudden, not weak, just deliberate. He folded his legs, curled his trunk inward, and exhaled once. Behind the wire, Rika turned away and walked back to the tree line. In the fading heat, the calf laid still. One ear flicked. A fly passed. The coals shifted. From his position, he could see the shape of Elian seated nearby, hands resting quietly on his knees, not reaching any more. There was nothing left to decide for the night. He had circled the fire. He had leaned into a hand. And now he had returned to the place that had first kept him alive. Not as shelter, but as choice. 3 days passed without change in the calf's behavior, and yet everything about him had shifted. He no longer trembled when touched. He accepted water from the cloth without flinching. He stood often, walked a few steps, and sometimes leaned his head into the ranger's leg before lying back down. But he never wandered far from the fire. The circle of heat, the low glow, it was the only boundary he obeyed. Then, on the 4th morning, a message came through the northern frequency. A low-priority transmission from a charcoal vendor who worked between the river edge and the Red Hills. His voice was quiet, cautious. He said he'd passed by an abandoned site 2 days earlier, saw animal bones, torn netting, and a half-covered pile of ash. He hadn't stopped, but he'd marked the location. It wasn't on any patrol path, and it wasn't new. Elian left before midday with 2 scouts, Toma and Nuru. They didn't take a transport, just packs, water, and time. The location was almost 2 hours beyond the gully where the tire tracks had faded, eastward, beyond where the grass broke into hardpan. By late afternoon, the land began to change. The soil darkened, trees thinned. And then they found it. It wasn't hidden well, just set far enough from paths that no one would wander into it. 4 long ropes hung from an acacia frame, each one frayed at the end. A large metal drum stood rusted and empty near the back wall of a half-collapsed hut. Nets lay bunched beneath thornbrush, covered in black plastic. And near the edge of the clearing, beneath a flat stone shelf, bones. They were elephant. Small, sun-bleached, a tusk tip sawed clean, no marrow left. Nuru knelt beside the tracks in the dust. A tire print, clear and intact, pressed deep near the makeshift hut. Wide tread, exact width, same as the one found near the calf's crawl path. No doubt, this was not a holding site. It wasn't for rescue, or breeding, or even storage. It was for disappearance. What stood here had been built not just to trap, but to erase. Fast, efficient, silent. The calf hadn't gotten lost. He had escaped. They circled the area for confirmation. No new movement. No recent fire. No fresh food stores. The site was abandoned. Probably cleared the day they found him. Maybe earlier. Still, the risk had been close. If he hadn't crawled in the direction he had, if the firelight hadn't been visible from the ridge, he would have died out there, unnamed, undocumented. Just another trace of what never made it into reports. By dusk, Elian returned to camp with a folded snare in his pack and dust on his boots. The others waited by the fire. The calf was lying in his usual place, trunk curled against his side, eyes half-lidded. He didn't stand as they approached, but his ear twitched once. He was listening. Elian crouched beside him, then opened the pack and set the snare coil on the earth, not close, not far, just visible. No one said a word. They didn't have to. The calf lifted his head briefly, then rested it again. He hadn't wandered. He hadn't fallen behind. He hadn't been born free. But he had chosen to crawl away from something built to kill him, and reach something that hadn't been built for him at all. And now, even with open ground and no fence, he stayed beside the fire. Not because he was weak, because here, he wasn't being erased. The land had softened by the time the rains returned. Not heavy yet, but enough to settle the dust and green the edges of the flats. Grass pushed through the cracks, slow and low, like breath returning to lungs too long held still. The calf, once barely breathing beside a fire pit, now walked with steadier rhythm near the sanctuary's edge. His steps were uneven still, his right hind leg a fraction weaker than the rest, but the limp no longer stopped him. He moved with the herd now. They didn't press against him. Elephants rarely rush acceptance. Instead, the others simply made space where he walked. Rika was the first to share shade. Another, a male just older than him, had allowed him to reach into the same water trough without shifting. There had been no trumpets of welcome, no loud greetings. But in the quiet days that followed, he was never alone. He had no name, not yet. Names came later, when the weight of survival began to lift. For now, he was the calf who crawled from the dark, the one who walked toward flame. Each evening, when the rangers lit the perimeter fire, he would come. Not immediately, not out of routine. But once the sky deepened and the first smoke line rose, he would approach. One step at a time, always from the same side. He no longer stood at a distance. He didn't need to circle. He simply came and stood near. That evening the air was cool and dry, the last stretch of light slipping across the tops of the trees like paint across canvas. Elian sat beside the fire, hands resting on his knees, not watching the flame, watching the edge of the trees where he always came from. And there he was. The calf appeared with no urgency. No other elephant followed. He moved forward, stopped briefly near a pile of fresh leaves the others had ignored, then turned his head toward the smoke. His trunk lifted once, not to smell, but to recognize. And then he came. He walked past the logs, past the bucket, past the basin. He didn't look at Elian. He didn't ask for food. He lowered his body slowly, knees first, then shoulders, then settled into the warm soil on the fire's near side. His back faced the flame. His face turned toward the open grass. There was no trembling now, no cloth needed, no eyes flicking with exhaustion, just a long breath released into the quiet, the kind that didn't beg for help, but offered it. The wind stirred the fire gently, lifting ash into the cooling sky. A rustle of hooves moved in the background as the herd returned to the further grove. A few rangers walked the fence perimeter with torches low, speaking only in glances. Elian remained seated. He didn't reach for the calf, didn't speak, he didn't have to. The fire crackled once, then settled. The calf's eyes closed halfway, not in sleep, but in rest, the way those who have survived allow themselves to breathe differently. There would be other nights, other calves, other rescues, but this one would always return when the fire lit, because the fire had not just saved him. It had told him, "This is where you stop running."